Oh, look at that. Excellent. So thank you, everyone. I'll get started in just a second. I just wanted to caveat today's presentation of I'm kind of a fluid presenter, so feel free to stop me at any time, whether you want to just come off mute and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Can you go back to that point real quick? I'm happy to do that at any point during the presentation today. So I like more dynamic audiences, so feel free to do that because I know we all have kind of come to be killed by PowerPoint by death. For everything that we have to sit through. So with that, let me share my screen and we will get going. So again, I'm Samuel Ragsdale. I'm the Director of Learning at 3M. I haven't started my journey at 3M. I'm actually fairly new to 3M and Minneapolis. So I came to Minneapolis almost 3 years ago now, right before the pandemic of 2020 started. So I got to be in the office for all of 2 months before then my workstation became my permanent workstation at home. And so there's my lovely workspace. I started the majority of my career in consulting and then moved to Microsoft, where I was there for 10 years. I was in web services and corporate strategy for a long time before I got recruited into HR, which I actually at that time thought was going to be a death sentence to my career because I was an engineer by practice and a strategist by trade and didn't expect ever to be in the learning and development, let alone the HR world. However, I found a home and a career there. And so I was asked to come into HR around the same time Satya Nadella started at the company. And the point of HR was to help digitally transform HR and be the test bed for products and innovation, which sparked my curiosity and my passion for things that I did not know, which was really empowering everybody to be able to achieve more. This has stuck with me throughout my career since starting at Microsoft and continuing on to 3M. Again, I joined 3M in 2020, and on my first day, I was challenged by the CHRO, then Kristen Ludgate, to how do you transform learning? What do we need to do, Samuel, to be able to become leaders in learning again? And so that's where my journey today will begin. Our journey started was in January 2021 or 2020 in Kristen Ludgate's office. So one caveat is I do run closed captioning. So I'm a inclusive design practitioner. And so for those that may have auditory disabilities, I want to make sure that everybody can follow along to the best possible. So it may be a little distracting, but I like to try to do it just so that everybody can participate. With that, let's jump in. So I would say we are still on this journey. So if you're joining today thinking that I'm going to show you a complete vision for the future of learning, that's not the case, right? This is now almost 2 or 3 years into our journey. And while we've made significant progress on that journey, we still have a long way to go. I think what's most important is sharing some of the things that were successful, some of the things that we learned along the way that can be transferable to anybody, anywhere you are. And so that's what I'm going to share today is our journey of creating a culture of continuous learning at 3M, where we are, what we've done, what was the most important things for us to do, how we thought about them, and then what's next? Where are we going from there? So again, we started in 2020 with this idea of establishing a vision and a strategy. Very fundamental. Moving to the concept of activating against our ecosystem, our brand and governance, creating a vision for learning and what it means at the company. And finally, our ultimate goal of getting to that culture of continuous learning, where learning is just embedded and prolific throughout the 3M ecosystem. Where this journey starts is a recognition of what's going on around us, right? And I think this slide is really important, is that for a lot of companies, we're not only transitioning from the third to the fourth industrial age, really we're transitioning from the second all the way to the fourth. For many of us, we kind of missed the third industrial age, the age of digitalization, right? Where we are today in the fourth is the age of big data and AI. That is driving the way that we interact and transact on a global scale. And it's like nothing we've ever seen before. It's changing the nature of work fundamentally. It's changing the name or the nature of jobs, where things are becoming more automated, more streamlined. AI is replacing a lot of the things that we do, and they're driving big analytics like we've never seen before, giving us insights that we need to be able to compete on a global marketplace. But for a lot of us, we haven't really caught up to that phase. We're still in the third industrial age. We're still trying to figure out, how do we digitally transform? How do we connect more seamlessly across boundaries? How do we use the technology we have today to be able to digitize what we need to be able to do? Really, where 3M was, still is transitioning to, is continuing that transition to the third to be able to leapfrog into the fourth. So it's important that we ground ourselves in understanding that we are on the precipice of the fourth. Many would say that we're in there. And most of us are still somewhere in between the second and the third. And this is an important concept as we think about what we can do, not being stuck in, oh, well, let's just get to this point. No, we need to transform all the way to the fourth. And how do we do that? I mentioned I started my journey in 2020. Part of the beginning of that journey was understanding really what was happening around us, both internally at the company and externally. And so I'll share a couple of stats with you and where we ended up from a benchmarking perspective. So first and foremost, we wanted to know what employees thought, right? What did employees think about learning at the company? 43% believed that they didn't have sufficient resources or external resources to build new skills and capabilities. The other percentage of no one said actually that they did. Most of them said that they did not, or that it's okay, right? So our employees were like, no, we don't really have the skill. We don't really have the resources we need. We don't have the time and space that we need to actually develop. 50% were asking for more time. There wasn't enough time in the day dedicated for learning and development. They couldn't do it within their 9 to 5. Anytime they were trying to do something, it was outside of working hours. We consider learning as part of the work job, right? This is important. We have to be constantly updating our skills to stay relevant in our role. We have to look at learning as a critical component of our everyday tasks. And currently, employees didn't feel like they had that time or space. We know from an industry perspective, it costs us 6 times more to hire external talent with the skills that we want than it does to build internally. That's a huge number, right? 6 times more. So every time I'm trying to hire those skills that I want, I'm paying 6 times more than it would cost me to build them internally. Interesting enough, 3M is a high tenured company, right? I think when I started, the average tenure was about 25 years. Coming from the tech industry, I was like, whoa, that's that's amazing, right? The average tenure for a tech company is like 5 to 7 if you're lucky. We had 27-year tenure, but we had a big part of our population starting to retire. What we were seeing was a negative skills flow coefficient. This was based on data coming out of LinkedIn and our skills cloud information. And it was showing that we were losing skills faster than we were acquiring them, and we were not building them at a meaningful rate. This was concerning, especially when you think about, well, what is the strategy then? To attract? We also had to look at what are we doing from a development standpoint, which we weren't doing a whole lot. Again, we know that skills are expiring at an ever increasing rate, right? From a technical functional skills arguably are expiring at a rate of every probably 1 to 2 years. The softer skills are actually starting to speed up too. We're seeing leadership, the qualifications of effective leadership in this modern age are starting to expire at a rate of 1 to 3 years. So we're even seeing soft skills expiration starting to increase. And we know from Gartner and from others that people were spending around $1,200 per learner per year in development. This is an average, right? So each company is unique. Each company is different. The range is anywhere between somewhere around $800 to $1,300 per learner per year. We took a look at the industry landscape. Who's doing it really well? Well, I have an affinity to Microsoft because we did a huge transformation there. So obviously we did benchmark Microsoft. But we looked especially at the consulting companies who their bread and butter is people. They have to constantly be retooling and updating the skills of their employees continuously and contiguously to compete in the market. These were really interesting benchmarks for us to understand the investment that they were spending and the time to upskill their employees. And we looked at other companies like Procter & Gamble, Target, and PepsiCo to understand what they were doing in the system. Most of them had taken significant investments in centralizing their ecosystems, updating their cultural attributes, focused skills development time, especially for supervisor and leadership populations. What a lot of people, though, weren't doing was general skills development across their employee population, which was interesting. Then we looked at from a maturity standpoint. So this is based on the PwC maturity model as 1 through 5. And don't, one is not bad and 5 is not great. It all depended on what you're trying to do with your business and where you're trying to go. So it's a relative scale, right? But it's important to understand where are you trying to go and where are you today. From a benchmark perspective, the companies that we benchmark were somewhere between strategic and expansive, right? Either holistic, aligned to business needs, real deep enterprise strategies, or moving into expansive, learner-centric, comprehensive, really focusing on the skills identification and skill need by role, by business, or by function. Where we were when we started this journey was somewhere in between utilitarian and reactionary, compliance-based, decentralized, limited enterprise integration. That's not where 3M wanted to be. 3M really wanted to be over into the expansive category, aligned to our culture, aligned to our vision and strategy of empowering or unlocking our potential of our people through science ideas. And so we had to think about how do we get to that point? What is the journey that we need to take? We understand what's going on internally and externally. We know we can do better. We want to do better. We also looked, and this may resonate with some of you, we also looked at our internal learning landscape. We had a proliferation of learning experiences that were disconnected and non-coherent across the enterprise. Some were enterprise-led, some were BG function-led, some were even team-led. We had multiple entry points. We had, I think at the last tally, we had 57 different entry points into learning. This was in 2020. So whether it was going directly to Coursera or going directly to Udemy or Brainstorm or Get Abstract or whatever it was, everything was decentralized. Your compliance training was in one place. Your role-based training was another place. Your skills development training was in another place. So we didn't have a clear or consistent brand of learning. We could do better. This also correlates back to probably why our employees were saying they didn't have the resources they wanted or needed to be able to develop. They couldn't find them. We probably had them, but they couldn't find them because they were scattered all over the place. So here's the problem set we were given in 2020 or back in 2020 to be able to solve. So then we had to ask ourselves, where do we want to go? What do we want to be? And this started our conversation with our corporate operating committee, our COC members, to align to a vision around what do we want to create from an employee experience perspective. This was important because this was the starting of our executive sponsorship, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But this is probably the critical component of our long-term success at 3M Learning, was aligning directly with our business and functional leaders across the company to champion why learning was important. And we showed them through the data, you're losing skills faster than you can acquire them. You're not ready for those jobs of the future because you don't have those skills. We can help. We know how to do this. From a visionary perspective, we align to this concept of accelerating our culture transformation and empowering our employees and driving our long-term business success. This is critical because it goes back to the business. Our metrics and everything we do is tied back to the business. And innovation by fostering a culture of continuous learning. If we have people who are continuously and insatiably learners, they're constantly developing themselves and the skills that they need, not only for today, but for the problems of tomorrow. So where did this start? So this fundamental concept was laid out with our corporate operating committee. and then went into how do we ensure that we move forward together in a unified way, and learning is elevated to a position within the company that is valued, right? And this is where sponsorship became incredibly important. So we look at our governance that we set up in two main prongs, one being our COC learning sponsors. So we end up going with a subset of our COC, which are part of our people and culture committee. These are the senior most people in the company that are able to make decisions and guide the direction of learning. This was important. These folks are now accountable for the success or failure of learning and help to champion the change that we're driving across the company. They ensure that our learning strategy aligns with our company strategy or vision, and monitoring our key metrics to make sure we're making progress, and challenge us, right, when we're not. The next layer was ensuring that we had a steering committee at the level of decision-making practitioners at the company. So these are folks like myself, who I am the head of learning, enterprise learning, but then I also work closely with my BG or business group and functional learning leaders across the company to ensure that we're moving together and executing our strategy in a shared and common way. This is also another critical component to ensure that we're all not going out and going rogue and continuing to add to that proliferation of brands out there, but focusing on the strategic priorities, aligning to that unified vision and driving it forward relentlessly, using a set of common, what I call design principles or operating principles to guide our work. That being is, what are we trying to do that aligns back to that vision that I just shared a minute ago? We're trying to create that personalized and adaptive experience to empower our people to develop those skills. Things that we do have to be connected and coherent, not just at an application or an ecosystem level, but also at a course and content level. We can't overlap. We can't duplicate topics. We need to have swim lanes in which we operate. When we do things that are shared, we need to connect back. How does this leadership attribute then connect back to driving sales excellence? Again, we haven't solved everything yet, but these are the principles in which we operate by. How do we make things more discoverable so we reduce that burden on learners going, I don't think we have the resources we need to be able to learn and grow. We also wanted to increase the quality bar of what we do. A lot of the times, a lot of our experiences were homegrown. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Being scrappy, really trying to create something, put something out there to pull the needle. But we also wanted to take a step back. How do we increase the quality control of our content? How do we ensure that also it's accessible for everybody, regardless of their mismatch between themselves and the environment they're in? So whether that's language barriers, physical barriers, disability barriers that come into play. And last and most importantly, and something that's near and dear to my heart that I actually talked about, I think at a Fredrickson Roundtable a year ago now, was how do we make it in the flow of work? Really what this is getting at is how do we reduce the barrier of entry? How is everything not just a destination, but show up in the workflow for the learner? That's actually on our agenda next, is one of our big rocks that we're moving for 2023. So as we establish our governance model, we have our vision for learning. Next comes our learning strategy. And this is probably the most critical piece of it. I'm not a big proponent of, after being in corp strategy for so long, I'm not a big proponent of a strategy document on a page. I like actionable strategies. So what you actually see here is probably more of a strategic framework built on 3 pillars with multiple dimensions. And each one of these is amazingly intentional in how we drove towards this. And again, lines back and approved by our executive sponsors. First and foremost, nurture a culture of continuous learning. This is around the environment that we create for learners to ensure that learning can actually be nurtured and take off. How do we ensure that people have time and space? That leaders teaching or everybody teaching is encouraged? How do we recognize and reward not just the process of learning, but also the outcomes of learning? How do we promote and give feedback continuously, tying back to our performance model, right? Again, how do we think about these things systemically so that there's a connection point across how we think about rewards, how we think about performance, and how we think about learning in a trio kind of way. So the first pillar is about the environment. The second pillar is about the individual, empowering learners to build and develop their skills, right? How do we give learners the tools that they need, the experiences they need to be able to proactively develop what they believe they need to be successful, right? Providing that personalized and adaptive experiences, consistent and recognizable, right? Again, going back to what we heard from our employees, discoverable and relevant and in the flow of work to reduce the barrier. Last and most important, well, maybe not most important, but very important, is drive innovation and fuel business growth. This is about the business. How do we ensure that we're continuously upskilling and reskilling our population? That we're boundaryless in the way we do innovation by sharing ideas, concepts, and skills mapping? How do we think about the agility and talent movement? This is where learning actually starts to dip into the talent space, right? We do have a role in that. We do call that out. As we're building skills, how do we then identify populations of unique skills that we have in the company and move them to areas that we need in the future, right? If I have a critical population of Power BI experts that sit in finance, but we need them in the business in the future as things adapt, how do I move that talent over? Right? How do we think about that from an expression standpoint? So when you think about this, it's the environment, it's the individual, and it's the business. And very clearly, the learner is at the center of the strategy. This strategy then became the frame for everything that we did afterwards. And probably most importantly, it helped us to prioritize what we're going to go after first, where we had to really think about two dimensions probably most clearly: our ecosystem, the way that people discover, navigate, and consume content and experiences, and secondly, how do we develop skills at scale? And those are the two elements that I'm going to spend the most time talking about today. Well, but before I do that, I also want to talk about one other critical component. This was a last minute addition that I wanted to add like last night. So this isn't as pretty as some of my other slides, but I think this is important too, that the state of learning in 3M was very different in 2020 when I started. We were a hub and spoke model where the hubs, the areas, had the most control. So they were driving localized development in country and region, right, across the globe, with very little connection back to the center, only focusing on key enterprise campaigns. So things related to like performance or maybe DE&I. Most of the work was done out in the hubs. And so as you can imagine, there was very little that connected each one of these hubs across. They were very autonomous in the way they were able to work and the way they were able to produce. From an economies of scale perspective, while it does provide people a high touch opportunity who are local, the enterprise suffers because there's no consistency in how we're positioning, how we're messaging, our language, or our experiences. And it doesn't enable us to scale one solution that's really fantastic, maybe in the greater China area, to LATAM because of the lack of connection. Where we moved in 2021 after we established our strategy, our vision for the future, and our prioritization was that of a functional model. So we moved to a global enterprise approach aligned by discipline within learning. So think of it now as I've taken people who are generalists in the areas and now align them to professionally into the learning function. So what that looked like was I have an operations team, I have a learning design and development team, I have portfolio teams, just like a business would have. I have facilitation and delivery, and I have business partners that engage directly with the businesses and functions. Again, for some of you who may have heard the term advanced 3M, 3M around 2020 also made a strategic shift, going from an area-driven model to a business functional line model. I caught up. right? Businesses were ahead, we caught up to that, and then aligning our goals and our strategies to that of the business and to that of the enterprise. Again, this is really important because this then goes back to our strategy and how we think about success. We measure success not through consumption, but through the success of the business. Again, this is why we stay relevant with our corporate sponsors. So I think that's probably also an important distinction to drive is we were not only transforming the learning landscape, we were also transforming ourselves in the way that we operated. I don't advise doing both at the same time, by the way. So I'll just caveat that. I don't advise doing both at the same time, by the way, because it is a lot of change that we had to manage. So I'm going to focus on my first topic. And pardon me, I've been talking for a minute and I need to take a sip of water. And again, I have a tendency to get on a roll. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me along the way. Sarah, is your hand up? I can't tell. I see that it's highlighted.
Nope, I tried to laugh at you saying don't do both at the same time.
Fair enough. So I'm going to start with our first problem set, right? In our first problem set, again, we had two main priorities besides organizational transformation that we wanted to go after first. The first one being that of developing a centralized, personalized, and adaptive learning ecosystem, one-stop shop for everybody that would eventually be turned into how do we have a destination and in the flow of work, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other piece was how do we drive skills development at scale? And how do we also tap into the neuroscience of individuals and understanding what is the difference between people who are learning all the time versus people who aren't learning all the time? And how do we also adapt and start to shift? I won't say I'm not fully declaring it yet, but how do we start to shift our learning methodology? And so really I call this our evolving our relationship with learning. There's some interesting stats out there for those that have kind of gone through the Gartner research, but there's a huge difference between those people who are considered heavy learners and those that are considered light learners. So light learners learn between 1 or less hours every week. Heavy learners learn or spend time learning formally, informally, right? This is formal and informal, more than 5 hours a week. And the benefits are absolutely tangible. Heavy learners are 74% more likely to know where they want to go in their career. I'm sure as learning practitioners, every single one of you has heard probably the same message from employees, especially lately, is career development. I need more around career development. And this also connects way back to the start of this message. Why are people asking for career development? Because they're tangibly seeing the shift in the marketplace going from the third to the fourth industrial market. And that's causing them to go, I've got to change. I don't know what to do, though, because there's so much coming at me. Those that are learning are figuring out not only what they like, but also what they don't like, which is equally as important, which helps to provide direction for them on where they want to go in their careers. So those that are learning more often know where they want to go. Almost 50% are more likely to find purpose in their work. 39% are more likely to feel productive and successful. Why? Is because when you're learning new ways of doing things, you're adapting them to your everyday practice, therefore driving efficiencies in what you're doing, creating new opportunities for yourself to no longer focus on the redundant work, but to focus on the things that are meaningful for you, that make you drive your curiosity, that engage your amygdala to be able to go and transform. So we know that people who are learning more often have tangible benefits that go through this. How do we use that as an opportunity to really push learning? This also makes us have to think a little bit differently about, the 70-20-12 or the 70-20-10 model, a little bit of the, formal, informal, on the job, and start thinking about it more in how is this more fluid in nature? How do we think about the blending of the formal, informal, and the social components of learning. And how do we think about it not only in the perspective of what is the company serving you, what are you engaging with formally or discreetly, and then what are you using from an on-the-job application? I think most of us, have attested that as the rise of the internet has come up, on-the-job training looks very different nowadays. Like, yes, there's SOPs that we all need to be able to like understand and do, but there's very little from, unless you're in actually probably a production role, there's very little that you're actually probably learning from a senior person, unless it's things like how to navigate the business, how to engage with leaders differently. So the nature of what you're learning is also changing. But the tactical functional things that you would learn, like, hey, I got to be able to create a pivot table. Well, I'm not necessarily going to go down and sit with the expert down the hall. I'm going to go YouTube it, right? I'm going to go get on Coursera. I'm going to go find it. So the nature of in the flow work or learning is changing around us. So it's not necessarily on the job as what we used to think of it as, but it's almost in the flow, the social component of learning. So how do we think about these different styles of learning coming together? What is the company's function in ensuring that we have the skills we need? This is where we started to bridge this idea of formal, informal, and social coming together into a common approach, which I will talk about in more detail. Next, we looked at what do we actually want to upskill people on? And this is where we spent a lot of time driving clarity for ourselves. We wanted to know very clearly, what are we going to go after and what are the other learning functions? Again, going back to the functional and technical leaders across the community, what are they responsible for? What are we responsible for? What do we care about? What do we not care about? We broke it down into 4 different categories. And we first one being that of leadership, right? Leadership is an attribute for everyone, but there is the higher component of focusing on what leaders need to know. But the higher, I guess you'd sum it up into leadership attribute being that of influencing others. Driving our culture, the behaviors that sit behind our culture, ensuring that we're operating in a consistent way, working together as a 1-3M. Enterprise core skills could probably be better summarized as power skills. What are those power skills that every individual in the company requires, or what different functions require? Think about things like communications, negotiations, the common practices of business acumen, project management. These are the core fundamental skills that everybody needs. And then finally, the functional technical. These really get into the role specific, the business specific, or the technical specific skills that are required to be able to execute a role or to execute a discipline. This is where we started carving out who's going to focus on what, right? When we think about skills development. Where my team focuses on is the enterprise attributes, that of leadership, culture, and enterprise core skills. That means that the functions and technical teams no longer have to worry about those pieces. They work with us to ensure that our programming strategy aligns to their business needs. And we take care of the development or the acquisition of that content at scale. That drives efficiencies in how we're spending, right? So that each business group isn't trying to go out and buy, communications training. Nope, we do it centrally. We gather those requirements and we do it on the behalf of the business. That has driven tremendous efficiency across our organization and a ton of cost savings because each one of us isn't trying to go and secure an enterprise deal. And it frees them up to focus on what they really need to go after. What they have deep expertise in too, by the way, is the functional technical skills, right? So for a cloud architect or for a senior science engineer, what are those skills that they need, right? What are those things that they need, whether it's Power BI, whether it's cloud architecture basics, SaaS, whatever it is. So the division of skills became clear. I felt it was important to do a double click too, because we spent a lot of time here also from a supervisor standpoint. That wasn't called out in that skills matrix that I showed just a minute ago, but we did a double click, whether you want to call it core skills for supervisors, or whether you want to call it part of our culture expression, we also felt it imperative that supervisors play a unique role in the employee experience. They control up to 70% of the employee experience. People mostly leave because of their relationship, whether good or positive, with their supervisor. And we wanted to ensure that all supervisors were equipped to be able to handle this VUCA world that we're all part of right now. And especially, this was especially acute during the pandemic when we started to develop these attributes. We spend additional time qualifying then what is the role of the supervisor and what is the skills that they need to be able to transform and to help support this culture of learning. This translated not just to the frontline supervisors, but all the way up the chain to the director level, the VP level, and ultimately the corporate operating committee level. And we sum them up very simply into 3 expressions of model, connect, and empower. How do you model a culture, lead with self-awareness and an emotional intelligence? Connect with transparency, curiosity, and vulnerability, creating an environment of belonging and support. And empowering others by unlocking potential, fostering trust within your teams. These became the foundational pillars and attributes in which we help to skill our supervisors around. So I thought it was important to take a small sidebar on our skills development piece here to talk about also the focus that we put on supervisors as a key lever in that culture transformation of creating the environment of continuous learning that we're trying to do. So ultimately, what is this? Based on this information, we started to think about the methodology in which we wanted to do this at scale, which we call learning tracks. This is skills development at scale at the enterprise level. So this is for our 45,000 non-production employees, soon to be for part of our production audience, especially for our production supervisors. The way that we think about this is, what are the skills that are needed for today and tomorrow? What are the emerging skills that we need for the future? How do we address the employee career development question in providing that consistent, scalable experience for all employees, all supervisors, and all leaders? What we've done now is we've assimilated using data from our business and functional strategic plans. What are the gaps that they see today and for tomorrow? They're identifying skill gaps and skill needs. Our 3M census. What do employees want? Where employees want to go? What is the data that we have available based on their consumption patterns and also their engagement patterns? And then what does the external market actually value right now from a skills perspective? We take this information and synthesize this and create what we call a learning track, which is customized to these 3 roles, or these 4, technically 4 roles, because it includes new supervisor. These 4 roles that we have at the company. And we provide skills development for them based on the skills that we identified in there. And so each year, an employee gets a learning track. And that learning track is anywhere between 10 and 6 hours of dedicated learning time. This is prioritized. This is expected of all of our learning, or all of our employees, dare I say required. It's a different stance on being able to drive culture at scale. Part of what we're doing with this is driving consistency of language, consistency of approach across our supervisor population, leveraging that framework I explained a minute ago as the foundation, and leveraging that skills framework to ensure that all employees have the basic attributions of how do you team effectively using our culture as the backdrop, right? How do you start to become more aware of what's going on from a digital perspective and how you use digital attribution to be able to affect your job? We continue to add those new attributions based on what's changing in our environment. This was the first year. So 2021 was the first year we introduced learning tracks. And our employee base has, I think I have a couple of my team members who are actually on today, so they'll correct me if I'm wrong, have around 6 months to be able to complete their track. So our tracks start sometime in the late spring and end right around late Q4 for us. So towards the end of the calendar year, they have 6 months to complete these immersive journeys, taking about an hour a week of their learning time to do it. Again, this is because we have executive sponsorship. This was then driven down from our business units. Now, the tricky part has been while we had excellent executive buy-in, support in driving this, the interesting thing that's happened is that as the landscape and as the markets changed around us, how do we maintain that support for learning, even though things become more turbulent, right? Supply chain then becomes supply chain becomes a focus, inflation becomes a focus. How do you keep learning at the forefront? We're still figuring that out, right? So far, we've been able to stay above the fray, but this is something that we have to continue to re-engage in of like, hey, you actually need to continue to your learning journeys because you're not going to be able to combat this supply chain problem as effective as you would have if you're not engaging in learning, if you're not learning some of these new ways of approaching. So it's required us to definitely spend a lot more time than we thought we would in the continuous change management, not just the change management up at the front. So that was a big learning for us, was just because we had sponsorship, just because we affected the change up front and really did a good job of leading into this idea of every year you're going to get a learning track, did not translate into we were going to have to constantly reinforce that, both at the corporate level and at the business level.
Hey, Sam.
Now, yes.
Oh, sorry. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Thanks. This is Steph with General Mills. So I just want to clarify. So each learning track is 6 to 10 hours for that track, and the employee has 6 months to complete those 6 to 10 hours of expected training. Am I getting it right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then totally understand you're early in your journey. On the earlier slides, you had said, Gartner has said the difference between less than 1 hour of learning per employee versus upwards of 5 hours per week per learning per employee. And so is that a benchmark for you, and or is that just an interesting data point that you're considering as you're developing these learning tracks? Just curious to get your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. It is a benchmark for me. And I don't look at how do I personally fill up those 5 hours with my programming. How do I take a portion of that? And then so that I seed an hour, and then the business and functions, by the way, are going to then start doing their own tracks here over the next several months. So then you have your technical track, they take up an hour a week. As you start to build that momentum of learning, what we're hoping that will happen is that learners will start to drive more self-directed. What else? Like, hey, this is great that I'm getting these things, but I also need this. So how do we, over time, really fill up that or start to move the company culture towards that higher end, whether it's the medium end of 2 to 3 hours or that higher end of 5? But how do we seed that, right? This is almost like a spark or a seeding exercise for us. And then over time, how do we actually start backing out a bit of the fray and allowing more of the learner driven, pick your own adventure, pick where you need from a skills deficit standpoint. And we stop dictating more or less of what needs to happen at a company perspective. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Yes. And that build was really helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that was a great question because it enabled me to also say, like, oh, by the way, our business and functional partners are also doing this from a technical functional standpoint. So again, we're in the first year of our learning or our skills development journey. And again, this year was a lot about how do we create consistency? How do we give people basically what we call the learn level, right? I'm learning the concepts, I'm learning the frameworks, I'm understanding, and I'm starting to probably get a little bit excited about it, right? I'm starting to get engaged. That was our focus for this year. So probably we focused on more skills than we technically really wanted to, but it was how do we provide a baseline across? As we go into 2022, which by the way, my team has already started the 2022 planning for a April deployment. So it takes us almost 6 months to create this, by the way. This is our new cyclical cycle. Is where we are focusing for 2022 is we're moving past now what we call the entry piece of the learn level and starting to go into depth. How do we focus on fewer skills, but really go into depth on those things that are most important? So for our example is like the learning track for our supervisor population will focus very deeply on empowerment next year. We'll focus very deeply on how do you create clarity? What is leaders' intent? How do you use leaders' intent as a model to create that clarity? How do you ensure that clarity sticks through exercises like back briefing to ensure mutual understanding? So
Samuel?
really our focus moves from that breadth to the depth as we go further into the tracks experience. Mr. Luke.
Yes, Leah Holmgren had a question for you on a little bit earlier topic. Are these paths knowledge driven or experiential driven, or both?
Both. Knowledge and experience coming together. And so we use a lot of scenarios in the way that we do it. So it's not just the knowledge, but we try to then layer in, here are the scenarios, and we work with our business counterparts to create relatable scenarios that starts to go into the experience of like, oh, I see how this is applicable to a sales cycle. I see this is how this is applicable to an engineering cycle. And so this is why it takes us 6 months to develop this, is because we're working closely with our business counterparts to contextualize. How do we create the relevancy here? Not just saying, here's the information you need to know, sage on a stage, here, blah, here it is. But how do we also then contextualize it so it's relevant to different populations of people? And then as we move forward in this expression, we're going to be doing a lot more social engagement through this. As you can imagine, you can't do things like this at scale with like a VILT. Most of the experiences we're talking about here are online or leverage social components where people are interacting and going through things asynchronously, but also communicating and connecting via social components. So we have partners like NovoEd that we leverage for our new supervisor program that enable that cohort-based experience. That's where we're trying to go more and more, right? Is think about that adaptive, that personalized, that engagement that's still required to drive deeper learning moments. How do we leverage those types of tools and technology to drive at scale with not necessarily having people in the same room? Because we have 45,000 people that we're trying to drive through this. And we also have to make sure that we do it in language, right? We have to make sure that we're doing it at pace. So the only adaptive modality that we can really do this in is online. So this is our approach for how we're thinking about skills development at scale. And hopefully I remember what my next slide is. I do. Okay, good. Now this strategy requires a strong technological framework that sits behind it to be able to execute. And this then we start to transition into what is our technology stack. And I kind of paint the front picture a little bit, right? We're moving from this outdated system. So we had actually one of our core systems, and those who are technology folks will laugh a little bit. One of our core system was a on-prem version of LSO or on-prem version of SAP. So I'm not sure I don't think it could actually even be updated anymore because of the layers of customization and how old it was. It's a non-supported application, basically, is what I'm trying to say. That was one of our core systems, non-supported on-prem application, along with the disparate proliferation of other learning resources across. There's no structured management. It was the Wild Wild West, right? Where we had no governance of our learning ecosystem. People could do whatever they wanted to. This made it further complicated because we work in a regulatory environment, right? Our production environment, because of our healthcare business, because of our transportation business, requires a validated system. This made it even more complex trying to do this. And we didn't have the organizational structure to be able to support. So we're trying to take all of these different brands of learning, all these different requirements to be able to create what I call more of the learning ecosystem. How do we think about architecture differently? Not necessarily one application, but a series of connected applications with a common entry point. This is the difference in the methodology. Is we're not talking about centralization from an application standpoint. We're talking about centralization from an access standpoint, from a learner point of view. But really our ecosystem is more like a golf club, or I'm sorry, a golf bag. Right, I'm going to use that analogy. Is in my golf bag, I don't play golf, but I know enough about golf. In my golf bag, right, I have multiple different clubs to do different things. I have a putter, right, I have a chipper, and I have a driver. They each provide a different utility for me, and one can't really replace the other. And the same is true for a modern learning environment. You can't just go with one application. You need to be able to do more. And LMS is really good at an LMS job. But if you're trying to drive social learning, you need a social learning platform. Not to mention content, right? I think most of us have experienced we can't build content fast enough at a quality bar that we want. We have to turn to syndication. We have to turn to acquisition of third-party content. And so we can't also have a proliferation of providers out there. We have to think about the centralization of that to drive the learner experience. The last thing I'll mention is that this year will be the first year that I will be able to actually tell you what is the learner engagement rate across the company. Because of how many systems that we had. I can't tell you at this moment in time how many people have engaged with what piece of content, because I'd be accessing 37 different systems. By the end of the year, we'll have one consolidated ecosystem with all the data, a common registry for all the data, so that I can actually report out what is the state of the state on the learning front. What is our activation rates? What is our consumption patterns? What's our MAU and DAO, monthly and daily active users? What are some of these higher level questions that we want to ask? Why do we need to know that? Is because the more data I have on the individual patterns of individuals, the better that I can recommend content. AI and ML require data to be able to operate. So now I finally have I will have a consolidated data front in which I can drive some of the higher order things that I want to do. Again, going back to where the market's going, driving personalization through AI and digital transformation.
Samuel, I have another question for you.
Sure.
From Mirella. How easy is it for learners to go outside of what is recommended to them? Does it need approval?
Oh, interesting question. It depends on the what. So, I think all of us have the ability to go out to like YouTube or TED Talks or whatever it is to consume something. But when we're talking about like, hey, I want to go to a conference, or something like that, that requires approval through supervisor or manager. Continuing education, also we have another process for how we drive continuing education, things like I want to get a master's degree or something like that. Now, if you're talking about how hard is it to like acquire like a license for like Coursera, say it's something that we don't have, an offering like that we don't have in our catalog, it's incredibly hard. And that's by design. Right? We have our governance council, our sourcing team becomes our first line of defense. Is our sourcing team knows like, unless it's approved through governance, we don't bring a new learning provider in. That's to ensure that we're buying things and using things in a consistent way so that we're spending our money smartly and that we're leveraging the things that we already bought or we've already bought. So anytime there's a new ask of like, hey, we want to bring in LinkedIn Learning or something like that, that's assessed through the Learning Council.
Hey, Samuel, we have another question from Mark Biederman. Are you
Sure.
using or planning to use an LRS or XAPI for collecting data or some other way?
Yeah, well, great question. Let me see if I can answer that in just a second as part of this transition slide, because the short answer is yes. We basically built a giant data lake because we have all of our data coming back to a single point of truth, a single registry, if you would. So from a learning experience perspective, we've taken this proliferation of different brands, different destinations down to a single stack, which we call 3M Learn. The backbone of that is our new LMS, which we went with SumTotal for, because it enables us to have a validated experience and it enables us to do a lot of things from a functionality perspective. SumTotal then becomes our register of choice, or register of choice for all of our data. So all of our integrations are done through SumTotal so that we're driving all the data down into the SumTotal data lake. Now, where we're going next is actually using an XAPI to connect then back to our people data. This is where it gets fun, is that because I've consolidated the learning ecosystem now, that there is one place people are going to consume the content because it's all integrated or stored there. and they're accessing their experiences through it, all the transactional and consumption data comes back to that core ecosystem or that core LMS. Then what I can do with that data is actually marry it with my people data. So I can start asking the harder questions. Do we see a noticeable difference in supervisors who've completed the supervisor training in their performance scores or their employee survey scores than we do with the ones that they don't? So what we're creating actually around that to answer the higher level question is, yes, we have an ecosystem of the learner data, but bigger than that, we're creating a data lake, right? It's no longer a data pool, it's now a data lake, marrying our people data up with our learner data. That's next on the list. So we haven't done that yet. We've sketched out the premise of it. But where we're really going next is how do we really start answering those higher level analytical questions, not just about consumption patterns and engagement, that's helpful, but also what does it mean? Why is it impactful? Why do we care? Because again, that helps me go back to our executive sponsors and show the difference in those that are engaging in learning and those that don't. Now, it doesn't, I'm not going to make necessarily decisions off of that, but it enables us to use that as part of the decision-making process. So we think about the world from an ecosystem standpoint, not just an individual application, but a series of connected applications. Everything from, again, our NovoEd platform that drives social learning, our core LMS, our content providers, and much, much more.
Sam,
Yeah.
can I ask another question? Hi, Steph again. So first of all, congratulations on getting down to a single LMS. That's amazing and a huge lift. Kudos. And are you considering an LXP?
Great question. So we did consider doing an LXP. One of the nice things about SumTotal was that they had taken Precipio, or LXP Precipio, and integrated it into the front end version of SumTotal, so that it was an integrated LXP LMS stack. So we ended up choosing not to then buy a separate LXP. And because of the open content network framework that SumTotal has, it enabled us to do the integrations like you would do with like a Degreed or something like that.
Sure.
So it enabled us not to have to do an LXP, but actually our first framework actually had like LXP, LMSs, CMSs, and then data lake as like a continuous ecosystem stack. But we were able to streamline that further with making really good decisions for us, right? One size doesn't fit all, but for us, around what was going to be our core platform. And that enabled us to say, actually, we don't need an LXP because we get this or this.
Nice. And then just one quick follow-up. Is the Precipio / SumTotal, does SumTotal offer the Precipio LXP as a full LXP or just scaled down version? Because I know some LMSs claim they have an LXP when really it's just a sort of a glorified front end. Are you finding that LXP is really a true LXP?
Yes and no. So there definitely has, like, it's not on the same level of Degreed. Sure. If that's what you're really getting at. It's not on the same level of Degreed, but it does have a lot of the attribution that I look for. Okay. I think one of the things that I was more impressed with is one of the big buying pieces is going back to in the flow of work. Yeah. What SumTotal did was they actually built a integrated Teams app. So the entire SumTotal experience is then accessible and searchable through the Teams environment. Yeah. And then that really created a utility point for me of like, hey, that bypasses some of what I would say from a destination standpoint and creates kind of that unique differentiator. Now, some would claim that, hey, if you wait long enough, Viva would do the integration and you could run the whole thing through Viva. I haven't seen Viva make a whole lot of headway since their announcement in 2021. So
yeah, Microsoft has some work to do.
Yeah, they have some work to do. So, I made my bets based on what I thought was going to be a good utility for today and tomorrow, and based on our real push to go for in the flow of work, that was a huge differentiator.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And I will say for those that are considering an LXP, I had a lot of great conversations with my IT department about this too. And I think it's worth, if any of you are considering an LXP, you are maintaining 2 integration points. You're going from a 1 system operating model to a 2 system with integrations. It creates more failure modes. It creates more complexity. And especially for us that are working in a validated environment, it creates a lot more complexity for us, because we not only have to validate one application, we have to validate a second application on top of that. And so for us, it was like, oh, we like the concept, but it didn't make sense for us at the time, if that also helps, Steph. The last piece that I wanted to touch on, and then I promise I'll stop and open it up for questions here for anybody who has additional questions, is it's not the change that'll kill you, it's the transitions. It's all the transitions that happen. What I mean by that is most of us can wrap our heads around the concept of moving from house A to B, right? Like, okay, I'm moving from house A to B. It's the transitions that happen that really get us. Think about it this way, like, what am I going to have to leave behind? Can I actually pack everything in these boxes? Are my kids going to like the new school? Am I going to like the neighborhood? Is the commute going to be longer than I used to have? Like, it's all of these things that come along with the nature of that change that creates anxiety, stress, whatever it is on the individual, uncertainty. Now, you multiply those change elements, you multiply the transition elements. So it's not just 3 changes you're introducing, it's actually all those transitions. So if each change has, let's just say 10 transitions to it, that's actually 30 transitions people are managing, not just 3 change elements. And so one of the things that we learned around this was we can drive change at pace. However, we have to be incredibly mindful about the frequency, duration, and intensity around how we're managing it. I go back to, we launched our ecosystem at the same time that we launched our skills development strategy, our learning track strategy. My team spent countless hours in conversations with executives, with learners, with supervisors. We drove multiple communications around this at the corporate level, down to the business level, down to the functional levels. We had one-on-one engagements. We had town halls. We did everything in our power to make sure that we helped to take some of the anxiety out of the system. However, from my analysis is, while we did an excellent job at the attempt, it was too much. It was too many change elements happening at one time. And while we have managed through a lot of those changes, one of the biggest things that we learned through this process is sequencing. How do we give more time in the system for the sequencing to happen? And so in a perfect ideal world, it would have been better for us to establish our ecosystem and not launch our skills development strategy at the same time, but to give people an opportunity to really adapt and understand, okay, I have to go to a new location. I understand what's here. Managers understand how to, reach their dashboards, consume that information, settle on that, then introduce, a massive then new piece around, and we're going to use this new environment to drive our skills development strategy. So the one thing that I could recommend, or one big learning that we had, is that it was really hard. Like, it was really difficult to manage all those transitions at the same time. And also, going back to previous slides, I was changing the nature of the way my organization operated. I was changing people's roles, I was changing people's functions from that being a learning generalist to now discipline aligned learning professionals. There was a huge learning curve for my team too, of how do I adapt to this type of thinking? How do I adapt to this type of coordination? And we're engaging with the business differently. So one of the big encouragements that I give everybody when I talk about these things is, we really kind of did a blitz, right? We had an opportunity, we had a window, and man, we drove to that. And it worked, right? It worked. But the level of transition management that was required was intense and exhaustive, and it still isn't over. In each one of these, you could say would have been intense and exhaustive. But sequencing becomes a key. If I had all the time in the world and could take it back, I would really have thought differently about the sequencing of events. How do we drive one change and get people used to a new habit, a new practice? Then build upon that with the next piece, and then build upon that with the next piece. So it reduces the anxiety and the stress that's created with those transitional moments. The other piece is the continuous engagement that's required, not only with my peer set, right, across the business and functional learning teams, but also the executives. Constantly reminding them of the value, constantly reminding them of the direction, constantly reestablishing our place within the prioritization of the company. This I can't emphasize enough. I think this is something that we've done well, is that really ensuring that everybody is along on that journey and that we're listening to our executives. As things change, we're also adapting to that. We're using their voice as an opportunity to then tweak things and then show them the results of that. And so that constant connection and communication with our executive sponsors is an important attribute that has helped us to maintain the trajectory and the intensity, right? I'm every day I'm grateful for my CHRO, because her mantra for many different things is, skills development and ecosystem. So she's still still helping to drive that transitional change for us with how she's positioning it, not only at an HR level, but also at a corporate level. So really engaging heavily with your executive sponsors becomes a really critical point in maintaining this type of intensity and this type of change. And so I guess in conclusion, we're really excited about the next phase of this as we continue on the skills development front. Where my team is going to be focusing a lot more is on moments that matter, really looking at experiences like the real big culture experiences that happen. How do we ensure that new hires have an excellent onboarding experience? How do we catch new managers at the beginning of their journey and equipping them with the skills and capabilities they need to be successful managers in the modern age? How do we do the same thing for leaders? As the leadership landscape changes, how do we ensure that every leader is able to create clarity and generate energy to deliver success? So we're shifting more and more to those moments that matter and leveraging big data to be able to tell stories and also drive insights. So I think I'm right at 15 minutes to the hour. I'm going to turn off my presentation now, and if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to share a piece of what they've learned, I'm happy to engage on those pieces.
Luke, you want to start with Jan's question?
Yes. So Jan was curious to know how your learning strategy is brought to your manufacturing and warehouse employees.
That is a great question. We started with our non-production audience, and now we're starting to transition into our production audience. Where we're actually going to start is in the production supervisor group. One of the things that we noticed is as we thought about engagement at scale, one of the things that was the sticking point for us was how do we engage with production employees who don't have access to a computer regularly, right? And also, when they're not working on the line, they're not producing they're not producing value for 3M. And I say value, I mean like they're not producing product. And so the first piece that we needed to break down was the technological barrier. So we actually have a couple of initiatives internally right now to say, how do we look at technology different in the plant so that we increase the accessibility of technology so that people in the manufacturing environment can engage. And so, how do we use things like tablets, shared tablets and shared tablet systems to be able to drive that? And then how do we think about the programming strategy for the plant so that we create as least disruptive of a process as possible? So we haven't figured that out. that's like we're laying like the minimum foundation for us to be able to do the engagement. And then next really comes then the sponsorship or the buy-in with our plant leaders, and then determining then how do we adjust our programming to be able to interact with our plant staff to drive that continuous upskilling within the breadth of time that we're able to engage with them. But the first step for us is the plant supervisors, right? Because they're a critical component to the environment of how work is going. And so we do have the opportunity to engage with them very much like what we do with our non-production our supervisors. So that's kind of the next thing that we're going after. But it's still a piece we haven't figured out yet. So if anybody has any best practices, feel free to DM me, because I'm happy to be a learner on that one.
So Samuel, this is Jan, just to add on to that. One of the things that we've found at Anderson, I work at Anderson Corporation, is yes to the supervisors, right? Obviously, and those executive sponsors up through that operations area. But the piece that we really found kind of the nugget is supply chain and scheduling. That if we are not aligned with that group, particularly scheduling, the supervisors, right, have limits placed on them that they can't sort of navigate around. And so there's this hidden alignment that has to happen in order for any kind of scheduled, right? If we schedule the training, it'll happen, but we can't put it in, outside of the schedule that drives our production and warehouse teams. So just a nugget that we've gotten some clarity around over the last couple of years.
That is a good one. I know our scheduling folks, and so that will be one of my next calls. So thank you for that nugget.
Hey, Robin, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure, Jay. So Samuel, you mentioned purchasing skill content to build scale. I was wondering then, from one of your earlier comments about having 3M specific scenarios, how do you build that into that purchased skill? Is it through the use of your cohorts that you mentioned, or are you structuring the learning pathways so that they first consume that skill content, but then apply it to specific 3M scenarios?
That's a great question. So I'll answer in a couple of parts. Is that we build content when it's specifically and uniquely 3M. We buy or syndicate content when it is something that we don't have expertise in, but others do, and especially at scale, right? So like I'll use project management as an example of that, right? Mm-hmm. So we buy in those cases. Now, what we often will do is we what I call bookend things. So we may use that module that we bought from like Udemy for Business as an example, but bookend that to be able to create the relevancy around the introduction, the consumption of that particular module, and then the exit of that of now let's bring it into 3M practice. So where we're trying to do more of is how do we use the third-party acquired content, I can speak, I promise, the third-party acquired content as the mainstay, right, the big bulk piece, and then use more of our developing and design time for the bookends. How do we create the relevancy and connect it back? We've had a lot of success in that. And we've also had to give up a little bit around chasing perfection of what like the exact language we want someone to use for something. We had to like give up on, like we just had to say, hey, it's close enough. It's 85% there. They just say one thing that we don't like we got to get over that. And so that took a while. That took a while for all of us to come to terms with. But it enables us to move so much faster because my design team is strong, they are smart, and they are capable, but they can't handle the volume of 10 hours per code. Like that's too much. And we tried to do that. We tried to do that. And then we had to really rethink our strategy around, we've got to use syndicated content to drive more and more of this. And we've got to think more about the bookends. We haven't perfected the art, but we're that's where we're heading.
Great, thank you.
Samuel, we've got a couple of more questions. Marella wanted to know if you let people use their personal phones.
I think so. I don't really know. Part of it I don't really know is because I've never been in, like, I've only been in the office like, a handful of times, so I don't really know the phone patterns of people. I know that some people have phones and some don't, and those that don't or have their personal phones then can basically can have it tethered to the company portal, and so that they could access learning experiences from their phone if they choose to. I know that our sales people do that. So it's there. We don't use, it's not a primary mode of consumption for 3M right now. I think our primary modes are really computers and shared tablets right now.
Yeah. She just clarified that she meant for production training instead of tablets. So
Yeah.
Sounds like tablets is kind of the main way for you.
Correct. Tablets is the main way for us right now, and there's a whole set of reasons why, but I don't know all of them. So we looked at a couple of different models. The model that we recommended was a shared tablet experience.
Okay, great. And then Aaron wanted to know, do the L&D leaders at 3M in the business report to L&D or report to the business?
That's a great question. So at this moment in time, they report to the business and function. So Dave Iverson, who's one of the big sales leaders, he reports into the business and function groups, but we work together, right? We have a dot line to each other as an accountability to drive and nurture each other's success. So my team works very closely with his to help, upskill and give them the information they need to drive the same type of things that we're doing at the corporate level. We work closely with our marketing folks. So I think of like people in this community, Justine Fitz, who may have spoken before. We work extremely closely with them, but they're all dotted lines. We're all dotted lines to each other. There's not a common reporting structure.
Got a couple more questions for you, Samuel, and probably won't be able to get a lot further than that. Where does product training fit in your model? Is it in the functional skills area or sales enablement?
Yeah, the functional technical. So the businesses are responsible for product training. So I use the example that I just did a minute ago. So like Dave Iverson does a lot of the product training for sales professionals, both inside sales, outside sales, et cetera. And so he leverages the core platform that we're putting together, right? And then if he needs an integration because of content or whatever, then he works with my team at the central level to ensure the integrations are done and as part of the stack.
Okay, great, thank you. And then Marie Reynolds asked, as you build your learning tracks, what is the balance of skills needed for today and skills needed for tomorrow? And then an even tougher question, can you expand on how you are predicting the skills of tomorrow?
I wish Mary Ann was on this call. So Mary Ann Thomas is my leader for strategy and career development, and she is one of the big architects behind Tracks, and she'd be able to give you the detailed answer. I will do my best to give you I'll give you the higher level answer.
Mary Ann says she is on the call.
Oh, and Mary Ann, do you want to take the question?
Oh, you go ahead and start, because anyone can connect with me offline.
Okay, so anybody, please feel free to reach out to Mary Ann on my team, who's fantastic and one of the key architects here. So how do we balance? What was the first part of the question, Jay? I remember the last one, not the first one.
Now I gotta go find it again. Bear with me. Sorry about that.
I can tell you, it's what's the balance between skills of today and skills of tomorrow, and how are you predicting the skills of tomorrow? And you talked a little bit about that. I was just hoping you could go a little deeper on your prediction algorithms. Yeah.
Yes. So right now, I won't say that we don't have necessarily a threshold that we're trying to drive for. So we're not saying like 70-30 or anything like that. It's part of this year's function was a level setting year. So this year was very little about the skills of tomorrow. We probably touched a bit on it when we talked about digital transformation and a couple other things, but we're really focusing on skills of today this year. So if I had to come up with a percentage for you, I'd say that roughly the majority of it for right now is skills of today. A little bit of it is skills of tomorrow. Over time, what I want to start driving is we get more towards the skills of tomorrow. We're starting to really think about the level 4 and 5 skill areas, the known unknowns, right? So like quantum would be a known unknown, right?
Yep.
That's where we're starting to head towards in the future, but right now we're really focusing on the skills of today. From a skills of tomorrow perspective, is we're using the talent neuron and Gartner data, right, as one of the chief pieces for that, to really look by profession, by discipline, by industry, what is starting to change and emerge from a skills pattern perspective. What is the market valuing? What's the market not valuing? And what's starting to pop? That's been a good predictor for us so far around how skills are evolving, and we're using that data to basically introduce new skill concepts.
Yeah. And Marianne added that you utilize the work of the voice of our businesses, and that what you found is that the plans also align to the benchmarking, especially to the power skills.
Yep.
I think it's 10:58. And so I'm not going to try and sneak one last question in on you, Samuel. Instead, I'd ask everyone to chat thank you or do their applause online or whatever they'd like to do. Or if anyone wants to boo, I'll pick on you later. But I would like to have everyone have a chance to say thank you. Just very, very informative session, and want to thank you, Samuel, for leading a great session and sharing your knowledge with us, and want to thank all of the people who spent their morning with us. I think we were right around 100 towards the top today, and I know we had more than a few cancellations this morning with, oh, I want to be there so bad, but something came up, which of course we all know how that works. So again, thank you, Samuel. And chat's blowing up. I didn't see any hand claps on. So again, thank you, Samuel, and thanks everyone for spending your morning with us. And everyone have a great day.
Thank you all. I appreciate the time and listening to our journey.